In this episode of Pilates Elephants, we're going to talk about Pilates for athletes. Is it a thing or is it just pixie dust and made up bullshit? There are 3 elephants and one of them is not an elephant. So come join us and find out what the truth and what's the pixie dust. Let's turn our attention to the next topic of the day.
Yeah, fantastic. So I actually the athlete who goes to Pilates to help with their performance. This is actually an interesting one because I've noticed there's been quite a growth in this realm of, you know, the last couple of years, and that's seeing things like athletes doing Pilates, you know, and you'll see, you know, an Instagram clip of it.
Yeah,
I trained a couple of when I was in Sydney, I had a couple of the Swans who used to come, so the football players who used to come to Reformer because they were told to by their coach. Something about glutes, something about... core.
Glute something,
so
core something, posture something.
That was literally, I would say, and these are one-on-ones, and I'd say, okay, what would you like to work on today? I've been told I need to work on my glutes, they're not firing, and my core. I'm like, okay, we can do plenty of glutes and core. Sure, it's Pilates. I've got a reformer here. Let's go. Let's do 50 million scooters and, you know, long stretches and get rid of the spring. And tick, I'm ticking but it's like, is that genuinely helping that player's performance?
No.
Okay. End of podcast. Play the outro now. That was a quick one. Awesome.
I think we can go a little bit more into it. And there's actually a surprise non-elephant in the room here. Which we can reveal a bit later.
A non-elephant.
Yeah. So I think the thing that kind of piques my interest about this is I see a lot of kind of workshops or things online advertised online for things like, you know, Pilates for golf or Pilates for dancers or Pilates for
the Pilates for golf and all the movements you do is to replicate golf, but you're doing it with it's like a draw the sword strap.
Yeah. Or Pilates for triathletes, and it's all about rolling out your IT band.
Pilates for runners.
Yeah, Pilates for runners. I guess that'd be a lot of rolling out the IT band as well. Maybe some front splits and legs and straps.
We have a podcast episode where we talked about the science behind rolling out ITB.
So I don't want to get into that here, but so I think there are a couple of elephants there. One is that, you know, kind of core strength is important for athletic performance, and so that if we spend an hour in the Pilates session or 2 hours a week doing Pilates, working on core strength every week, that is going to be a worthwhile investment in terms of return on investment being improved performance, right? Bearing in mind that 2 hours, well, what's the alternative? We could spend it on something else. We could spend it in the gym, or we could spend it doing technique practice, or we could spend it recovering, you know. And so what would be the best use of that 2 hours? And so that's one thing, you know, core strength is important for athletic performance. It's important enough that we should invest in it. And the next one is this question kind of muscle imbalances. You know, that which we hear about a lot, where it's not so much necessarily about improving performance for athletes, but like, for instance, athletes, as we know, have a lot of imbalances, right? So if you're a athlete who does a one-sided sport like tennis or shot put or javelin or fencing or something like that, where you're predominantly working with one side of your body, you're gonna have imbalances. Like the throwing arm on a shot putter is gonna be way stronger than the non-throwing arm, even if they do lots of gym work, working on both arms and all of that. It's just their work. They're doing like 10,000 shots a month or whatever they're doing. It's like you're gonna get stronger on that arm. And that's the same for most, you know, unilateral athletes, and probably the same for most bilateral athletes. Like I know that I remember me reading that Usain Bolt takes different length strides with each leg when he sprints.
Yeah, right.
You know, so presumably there's either some combination of different range of motion or different amounts of power, you know, in each of his legs there, but doesn't seem to be harming his performance any. But so I think the main kind of thinking around this, or the main elephant around this, is that correcting muscle imbalances will reduce injury risk. And so we look at people's, their left leg versus their right leg, their left scapula versus their right scapula, whatever. Try and correct those imbalances. And the third one, I think, which is what I mentioned at the top, is that we can practice these athletic movements, like you said with the golf, right? So if we kneel sideways on a reformer with a half spring on and hold the strap and twist our torso really slowly, right, that's going to make us better at hitting a golf ball. And that is, I'm sorry, that's just BS. But we'll talk about why that's not true. But so one of these is not an elephant.
I don't know where to go with this. Which one is not an elephant?
Well, you have to listen into the rest of the show and find out.
Okay. I'm listening.
All right. So, So let's talk about the one that's obviously an elephant first, right? Which is the last one, which is basically the idea that you can get better at lifting heavy things really quickly, right? Or whether the heavy thing is your own body weight, you're sprinting or whatever, right? Even in golf where you're not lifting something heavy, you're moving really quickly.
Yeah.
It's speed, right? The speed of the club.
Yeah.
And you can get better at doing that by lifting really heavy, really light things really slowly, right? Which is what Pilates is. And that is, hopefully if you're listening to this, you're already just thinking, well, that just plain doesn't make sense, right? Because in exercise science, we have like a couple of foundational principles that are like the first thing you learn on day one of your exercise science degree, right, is the principle of specificity. And what the principle of specificity says is exactly what you train is exactly what you get better at doing. So if you wanted to be really good at hitting a golf ball into a little hole 400 yards away, practice hitting a golf ball into a little hole 400 yards away.
And focus on the hole, because that will be your external focus.
Right.
Yeah.
And so pretty much anything you do that is not exactly that is going to be less effective, right? And so if you think about, okay, practice hitting a golf ball into a hole 200 yards away. Well, that's not exactly the same skill. Practice hitting a tennis ball into a hole 400 yards away. That's not exactly the same skill. Practice playing croquet. Well, that's not exactly the same skill. Mini golf, not the same skill. And so of course there's some degree of transfer between those skills, right? So if you're amazing at mini golf, you'll probably be better at regular golf than someone who's never played mini golf or regular golf, right? But if you spend 100 hours practicing mini golf, compared to someone who spent 100 hours practicing real golf, you won't be as good at real golf, right? And I'm saying real golf because I don't know what a proper, mini golf's real golf too, but it's like, what I'm talking about, like golf on a golf course. So yeah, the principle of specificity says that whatever you practice is exactly what you get good at, right? And so when you're kneeling on a reformer with a half spring pulling on a strap and you're doing a torso rotation, right? Well, there is something about that is similar to a golf swing in that there's a torso rotation, right? And there are about 6,000 things that are not the same as a golf swing. You're on a moving platform. You're kneeling. You're working against a spring resistance. You don't have the inertia of the club. You're not using a club. You've got a strap. You're not hitting a golf ball. The range of motion is different. There's no motor skill involved in placing the golf ball in a hole.
It's starting to sound more and more outrageous. And for our listeners out there that are thinking, "Ugh, I've done that before." With the hey guys, so have I.
We forgive you. You're cool.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Once you know better, you do better. Yeah. It's like once you've seen it, you can't unsee it.
So, is there anything wrong with kneeling on a reformer and twisting with a strap? No, it's awesome. Great work for the external obliques, internal obliques. Fantastic, love it. But is it going to make you better at golf? Bum. Yeah, so I think
a no.
That's a no.
That's a no.
And that's just from kind of basic principles. I mean, we know that so if we think about something other than golf, like a more kind of what people would traditionally think of as a more athletic sport, like football or running or jumping or something like that involves speed and power. Okay, well, to produce high amounts of force, to accelerate your body or a weight or a ball or whatever quickly, you've got to recruit what's called your high threshold motor units. So when in your body, each arm, each leg, each joint, you have several thousand muscle fibers, so we just say in your quadriceps, you might have like 7,000 muscle fibers in each muscle, right? I don't know if that's the exact number, but several thousand, right? Yeah. And each of those muscle fibers is a muscle cell, and it runs the whole length of your quadriceps. So it runs from the top of your thigh bone down to your kneecap, right? So there's like a 18-inch long muscle cell, right? And you got maybe 6,000 or 7,000 of them. Now, those are arranged in bundles, right? And each bundle is innervated or supplied by one nerve, right? So you have a nerve going to a bundle, and there might be a bundle of, say, 20 fibers, right? And they get one nerve going to that bundle of 20 fibers. And so whenever that nerve fires, all of those 20 fibers are recruited, right? So you can't recruit just one of them. You can recruit all of them or none of them, right? And then you've got another bundle of 20, another bundle of 20, another bundle of 20. And then you've got some bigger bundles of 100, right? And then you've got some bundles of 500. And then you've got a couple of bundles of 1,000, right? And so what happens is they're recruited in size order according to something called Heinemann's size principle, right? So if you're doing something that involves really, really low demands for strength or force, right? Just say you're standing upright with your legs locked, right? Where your quadriceps can basically be relaxed, you don't have to do much, right? But there's some tiny amount of force required, right? Well, you recruit the smallest bundles, right? The 20 muscle fibers. And they're called the low threshold motor units. Like a motor unit is just all of the 20 fibers plus the nerve, right? So it's that bundle. And you recruit those because they don't produce much force. So when you don't need much force, you use those, right? And when you need a bit more force, we recruit those plus the next 20, right? And when you need more force, plus the next 20, plus the next 20. And then when you need even more force, you recruit all of the 20s plus 100, right? And when you need more force, all of the 20s and all of the 100s plus a 500, right? And so as you need more and more force, you recruit bigger and bigger and bigger motor units, right? And so the only time that you recruit those 1,000 fiber motor units, they're like the big ass, really powerful, when you turn that baby on, like, that would be like jumping, right? Or hopping, things that are very, very demanding on that muscle. Does that make sense? Sprinting. Yeah. Yeah, sprinting, jumping, a maximal squat, a maximal deadlift, something like maximal jump, those kinds of things. And so you only ever recruit those high threshold fibers, the 1,000 fiber motor units, right? When you basically get above 85% of your maximum voluntary contraction, right? So 85% of the load that you can lift one time, right? Above that, you're recruiting all of your high threshold fibers, right? And so and athletic performance depends on those high threshold fibers, right? So like if you want to get good at exploding, in a 20-meter sprint or whatever, you've got to get good at recruiting those high threshold fibers, right?
And you get good at recruiting those high threshold fibers by doing the thing. Recruiting
those high threshold fibers.
Because I found it really interesting when I was at Greg Lehman's course, when he was talking about glutes and, how everyone's glutes are inactive. All the glutes, all the butts in the world have gone to sleep kind of thing. I think he's got a great blog about that.
Have the butt muscles of the world gone silent?
The butt muscles of the world gone silent. It's such a good blog. We'll put it in the show notes. What I was a bit of an eye-opener for me is he was like, okay, well, if you're walking, it's actually minimal glute.
Your butt doesn't work, much.
You don't, bum, whatever. If you want maximal glute activity, it's sprinting.
Yeah.
Sprinting is maximal.
Same with hamstrings.
I started doing a lot more sprinting after knowing that. I was like, okay, cool. So he's like, literally, if you want to do the best butt workout, is the sprint.
Well, look at Olympic sprinters. Look at their butts.
Yeah.
They've all got them.
So I started sprinting after that. Effective. Sprint up a hill, even better. Whew.
we were talking about the butt muscles of the world gone silent, and the fact that basically, in athletic performance, it's those high threshold motor units, the big bundles of fast twitch muscle fibers that you recruit to produce those explosive movements, move heavy objects, whatever. And the only time we recruit those is when we do explosive movements and lift heavy objects, because of Heinemann's size principle, which says that we recruit the smallest motor units first and then progressively bigger. And so when we're kneeling on a reformer on a half spring twisting, we're not recruiting our high threshold motor units.
And when I'm thinking, the good old donkey kick back with one foot in strap on the reformer, we're like, yeah, let's really work our butts here.
No, yeah, you won't really get a lot of recruitment of high threshold motor units in that. So if you want to get good at moving explosively, you've got to move explosively.
Okay, so Pilates instructors listening to this are now probably thinking, well, can we recruit those high threshold motor units in a Pilates class?
Sure.
And if so, how?
Jump board, heavy springs, single leg, bam.
Oh, dang, my thighs are burning just thinking about it. Right, okay.
Heavy scooters.
And by heavy, define heavy.
I'm talking about you have to have your hands on the foot bar, otherwise the reformer's moving across the floor heavy.
Okay. Shaman did some of those with us in a masterclass recently, and I had DOMs in my booty for about 48 hours afterwards.
I'm talking about you can only do 5 reps and then you can't push it out the 6th time heavy, like 3 to 4 springs.
I was going to say that's a lot of springs. Right, okay.
But
that is I'm envisioning my reformer at the moment sliding progressively.
Right, but that's athletic conditioning, right?
Right.
Athletes need high load, high speed practice to get good at high load, high speed movement. Like that's the principle of specificity.
Okay, so
and you can do that on arms too, right? You lying on or kneeling on the carriage, pushing, like jumping, like pushing off the foot bar, and then like a jump board type scenario, or you could push off a jump board.
Yeah, I reckon would it not be hard enough to load it enough in that respect though? Because
if you're kneeling on your carriage, feet back against the shoulder pads, right? Hands on the jump board, let's say.
Yeah.
I reckon 2.5 springs, bam, that's pretty heavy. And I'm talking about jumping, plyometrics, your hands leaving the foot bar and then catching.
Yeah, I'm erring away from foot bar situation on that heavy. Good chance and smack my chin on the foot bar.
All the more incentive to
not smack my chin on the foot
bar. Yeah, all the
more
incentive to produce an explosive.
To land it.
Yeah, acceleration with your arms.
Okay, so we've talked about muscle recruitment. What about core? Because I think the big, and that was the one I heard, apart from glutes, the other one I predominantly heard from my athletes that were coming in was, I need to work on my core. And a lot of the athletes I worked with as well were quite tall. I'm talking 6'3", 6'4", tall lads. And they seem to correlate being tall as well with a weaker core. That was their narrative.
My guess would be when they do a plank with their 5'1" girlfriend, their 5'1" girlfriend can go for 4 times longer than they can.
Can outflank them.
Yeah. Why? Because of having a much shorter lever and a lower higher strength to weight ratio.
Right, which is what you see in a lot of gymnasts. Gymnasts tend to be shorter, as do most pro surfers. Yes, there are some taller surfers, but the majority of the high-performing surfers are actually short. Your Kelly Slaters, etc.
Well, in gymnastics, for example, it's all about power to body weight, right? Because you need to lift your own body, right? So high strength to weight, high power to weight ratio is going to make you better. So what you need is low weight and high strength, right? So people who are small, that's a prerequisite, and strong is prerequisite for being gymnast. Whereas if you're an Australian rules footballer, you need to jump higher than your opponent to catch the ball. So being tall is selected for. And power to weight ratio is much less important.
Okay. Any correlation between a strong core and sports performance?
Well,
and I'm guessing you're going to say it depends, and maybe it depends on. I'm guessing if you're a gymnast, having a strong, whatever we define core as?
Where do
we go with this?
The literature that I've looked at is there are a couple of systematic reviews, which I'll link to, one from 2013, Martuscello et al., and one from 2020, Olivia Lozano et al., and they both looked at the core muscle activity during various exercises. And so I think the first thing I want to talk about is, well, is Pilates actually the best way to strengthen your core?
Could I pull us back from that further first and go? The first thing we talk about is can I ask what is being defined as core here before we even go to that? Like, what are we talking about?
All right. So in this literature that I want to talk through now, they're talking about basically the core being everything from your ribs to your pelvis, right? So it's the rectus abdominis, the six-pack muscle, the external and internal obliques, the transversus abdominis, the erector spinae, the back extensors, and the lumbar multifidus. Mm-hmm. So that's what they're talking about when they talk about the core.
Are they adding in pelvic floor and diaphragm, which you often
in
hear?
this literature, they're not, because this literature is simply looking at which are the best exercises for activating the core, right? And so the way that they do that is they stick fine needles into people's rectus abdominis or multifidus or whatever.
Fine needles?
Yeah, like electrodes, right? And then they, connected by wires to a little voltmeter, right? And then they get them to do various exercises, and then they measure how many volts went through the muscle, and that tells you how much the muscle was recruited.
Wow, I didn't realise that needles were inserted.
Well, they can do it with surface electrodes, right? But if you want to measure, say, the internal oblique, well, it's called the internal oblique, right?
Gotcha.
It's under the external oblique.
Yeah,
so how do you get to it? If you put a surface electrode, it's just going to pick up the external oblique. So you have to stick a needle through the external oblique into the internal oblique to pick up the signal.
People just happy to put their hand up for these sorts of things.
Sure, I'm a
Sticks and needles in
second-year
me.
college student. I need $20,
All the needles.
Sign me up, yeah.
I think I'm just sitting here going, I couldn't think of anything worse than having needles stuck in me and then I need to actually perform exercises.
Give you $20.
Mate, you'd have to pay me way more than 20. I was already set up and pay $500 for a session with Heath.
These were a couple of systematic reviews that looked at various different types of exercises and how much they recruited these muscles. And so obviously when we're checking out, like, is someone recruiting their diaphragm? Well, you can't use a surface electrode for that. And that is, so they usually use ultrasound, and same with pelvic floor.
Right.
So we can't use a surface electrode. We can't really use a needle for either of those. So we have to use ultrasound, all right? And if someone's doing a plank on a fitball with one leg in the air, it's really hard to get an ultrasound machine on them and visualise what their diaphragm's doing.
Yep.
So basically this hasn't been studied.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And let alone if they're doing like barbell squats with 100 kilos on it, or, it's like, how do you do it, check what the pelvic floor is doing?
Yep.
So it turns out that, so they basically evaluated 3 different categories of exercise. So like traditional, like, quote, core exercises like, crunches and sit-ups and fitball planks and things like that you'd get at your personal trainer. And then they looked at sort of like core activation exercises, like, lie on your back, contract your XYZ muscle, don't contract your ABC muscle, that kind of thing. And then they looked at free weight exercises, so barbell squats, lunges, push-ups, dumbbell bench press, things like that. And what they found was that for the rectus abdominis, the six-pack muscle, for the external oblique, and for the erector spinae, your back muscles, the highest levels of recruitment were found in free weight exercises. Mm-hmm. So if you wanted to, for instance, to strengthen your abs, back squats, heavy back squats are the best. There are a couple of other free weight ones that are pretty good. Anything for the external obliques that involves unilateral movement, so like a barbell lunge or a kettlebell lunge or a unilateral dumbbell bench press, right? Because the obliques have this rotational function, and so when you're working against rotation, that's when you're really recruiting your obliques. So, we could translate that into Pilates and say, okay, well, kneeling or standing like a punching exercise, with a heavyish spring that you're really working, okay? Or some kind of, if you've got some kind of, hand weights or whatever, or bands in your studio that you can use with a squat, to load up the squat. Okay, those kinds of things. So that's for rectus abdominis, external and erector spinae. For internal obliques, unilateral exercises like, and the one that they found was highest were 2 on a fit ball. One is a elbow plank on a fit ball, lifting one leg. Right?
Elbow plank on a fit ball, lifting one leg, holding everything still.
Yeah, and that really so basically it's leg pull front, right?
Yeah.
But on a fit ball.
And keeping it still as well.
Keeping it still, right?
Okay.
And that gave the maximum recruitment for the internal oblique.
Yeah, right.
And the other one they found was a Stuart McGill exercise called stirring the pot, where basically you keep both feet on the floor, your elbows on the fit ball, and you kind of circle the fit ball around.
He'll own that one, does he?
Yeah, it's one of his big 3.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure if he made it up, but it's his kind of.
Okay, I used to teach a huge, back in the day, a big mat class, and the theme was fit balls. This place had enough fit balls for everyone that came to class, which was pretty fun, and we used to do that
fit
one.
Ball wars and things.
Yeah, well, we did. You'd absolutely. I'd do partner work, and they'd be throwing them at each other. It was one of my favourite classes to teach, and that exercise, the old stir the pot, you can make people cry with that one. It's a great exercise. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's good for internal obliques.
Right.
Transverse abdominis. The conclusions was there's poor quality and sparse research, so we don't know. So the 2020 systematic review only found 3 papers in all of the history of science that have looked at the recruitment of transversus abdominis.
For the magic transversus abdominis.
Yeah,
What?
That have looked at transversus abdominis recruitment in different exercises.
For the amount that the transversus abdominis gets spoken about, gets focused on, and importance given it to it in the Pilates stratosphere and in the rehab stratosphere, I'm quite shocked by that.
Yeah. So there's 100,000 million studies on how do we recruit transverse abdominis lying on our back with an ultrasound on our belly.
Right.
But there's only 3 studies, according to this 2020 systematic review, right, of how much does transversus abdominis, how much is it recruited in, say, a plank versus a bird dog versus a squat versus a side plank versus a whatever.
Wow.
Right? Yeah, and the answer is dunno.
Wow.
So 3 small studies, not of great quality, is all we got. So, it's like when you're a poor uni student and you want to buy yourself some takeaway dinner, and you're looking in your pockets and there's only a few little copper coins in there, and you're hunting down the back of the couch,
Hey, been there.
That's about where we're at with the transversus abdominis literature on what exercise is best for activating it.
Wow.
Sparse and poor quality. And when it comes to multifidus, your sort of deep spinal muscle, the highest levels of activation were in barbell exercises, prone row, with a barbell of 45% of 1 RM, and heavy deadlifts and back squats.
Wow. You
get the greatest activation of multifidus. So all in all, they basically say, well, all taken with all, if you want to maximise your abdominal and core strength, what you should do is a hell of a lot of heavy free weight exercises and maybe some stir the pot.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so we've talked about how to strengthen the core.
Mm-hmm. So if athletes are doing heavy strengthening work for their explosive jumping power or whatever that they're developing in their gym, in their strength and conditioning program, guess what?
They've already ticked
their core's
this off.
fucking strong.
They don't need to come to Pilates specifically to strengthen their core. In fact, it's probably not the best avenue.
It's not the best. Unless you're doing more stir the pot.
I was going to say, unless you were coming to my fitball class where we did plenty of that.
Or, leg pull front on a fitball.
Yeah.
Now, there are lots of exercises in Pilates that obviously do recruit those muscles and can work them. But in terms of how much they are recruited, how much load is on them, pick up a barbell.
Which I find that most athletes are doing anyway,
and
regardless of which sport they're in.
Right. And when I say barbell, it could be a kettlebell, it could be a dumbbell, whatever. Just pick up something heavy, right?
Yeah.
And you can probably find ways to do that in a Pilates setting, right? But it's got to be heavy. It's got to be heavy, right? Heavy defined as you can only do 5 or 10 reps tops. You know, and so like, all right, think full push-ups on a long stretch on a half spring, right? Or think one-handed push-ups if that doesn't seem hard enough for you, right? Think front splits with no springs on, like, you know, like heavy, hard. Think one-legged scooter with 3.5 springs or 4 springs.
I'm going to try that when I get home.
Well, one-legged scooter will be awesome because it's got that rotational aspect, so you're going to be working your internal and external obliques quite a bit, particularly if you're bracing against the shoulder, against the foot bar or the jump board, right? There's a real rotational.
Love it.
Yeah. So, all right. So does core strength help athletic performance? Well, the answer is marginally.
Okay.
According to a systematic review and meta-analysis from 2016 called The Role of Trunk Muscle Strength for Physical Fitness and Athletic Performance in Trained Individuals by Presky et al. And what they found was that basically... and there's another systematic review, from 2012 called The Effects of Isolated and Integrated Core Stability Training on Athletic Performance Measures. And that was Reed et al. And I'll link to all these in the show notes. And basically what both of these have found is that there is a very slight benefit on athletic performance when you do core strengthening exercises. But that the cost-benefit analysis, like the opportunity cost of the time that you spend doing those core strengthening exercises, you get a much bigger benefit to athletic performance by just doing sprints or heavy squats in the gym or some other explosive exercise that's more skill practice, you know, something that's more specific to the athletic performance.
So that marginal advantage, though, if we're talking about an elite athlete and where marginal advantages can actually be the decider to whether you win or not, are we seeing benefit there then?
Typically what these studies, that's a really good question, and typically what these studies do is they split the athletes into 2 groups, and they say group A gets to just do their regular athletic training, right? So that'll be like, 2 or 3 strength and conditioning sessions a week, plus their skill practice, plus their match play, right? And then group B gets all of that, plus 2 hours a week of core strengthening.
Right.
And then what we find is typically the core strengthening group, 12 weeks later are like, 2% better. Or 1% better, whatever, at the athletic measures, jump height and sprint times and whatever. Okay, but what that tells us is if we do an extra 2 hours of training, we get a little improvement, right? But what if we spent that same extra 2 hours practicing sprints, right? Or what if we spent it in the gym doing explosive drop jumps? Or what if we spent it on skill practice and strategy for the game, right? Would that give us a bigger benefit? And based on the principle of specificity, the answer is very likely that, it would give us a bigger benefit if we spent that time on more specific activities to the sport. Because they're when they're studying this, they're not equating for training volume generally, right? So it's like one group gets their regular training, the other group gets that plus extra. Right, and the extra is core strengthening. But what I'd like to see would be a study where one group gets the regular training plus 2 hours of core strengthening, and the other group gets their regular training plus 2 hours of sprinting,
or
2 hours of something else.
And there's no
right?
studies like this?
No.
How? Why? I don't get it. There's so much, there's so much money in sport. There's so much everything in sport. I'm surprised that they haven't looked into that in regards.
Poor research design.
Interesting.
So,
Okay.
So there is. So what these studies generally find is they use the word marginal, right? There's a marginal relationship between improvements in core strength and improvements in athletic performance. So it's a very, very small relationship, but it seems to be consistent. And so basically, for most sort of high level athlete, or for basically all athletes, it's probably a better, use of time to spend more time on sport specific training or explosive high load training, which is going to improve their explosive high load performance more. So I think that's a pretty clear finding in the literature. But there is one area where we found a non-elephant.
I've been waiting for this non-elephant.
Well, before we talk about that, let's take a little break. How's that, Viren? All right, so before the break, we talked about core strengthening and its relationship with athletic performance, which is pretty marginal. And in fact, athletes are probably getting plenty of core strengthening just by doing their regular old athletic training and their gym training that they're probably doing. Mm-hmm. And then we said that there is one of these elephants is not a real elephant at the start of the show. And
I'm waiting with bated breath, as I'm sure are all our listeners.
And it's the one about muscle imbalances.
Oh.
But there's kind of a twist on it. So when, if you're a Pilates instructor and you hear the term muscle imbalances, what you probably think of is, left versus right imbalances. Or
I think a lot of the time Pilates instructors think cross slings. The whole. No.
What do you mean by cross slings?
Basically, if you've got more of a kyphosis.
All right, so your pecs are too tight and
correct.
your rhomboids are too weak or whatever.
That's what I hear all the time still. Yeah.
So what the literature shows is that there is a relationship between muscle imbalances at a joint, and particularly the shoulder joint when we talk about, but it's not the ones you think. It's the relationship between the concentric internal rotation strength of the shoulder. So think about a baseball pitcher, mm-hmm. right? As they pitch, they're rotating their shoulder into internal rotation, right? And then after they release the ball, they have to decelerate their arm, right? So they move from using their internal rotators concentrically, right, to accelerate the arm.
Right.
Now they're using their external rotators eccentrically to decelerate the arm, right? And so typically what we see is that pitchers, throwing athletes, have very strong internal rotators, right? Because that's where they produce their power, right? Yep. That's how they and these guys and girls can rotate their shoulder like at 9,000 degrees per second.
Wow.
Right? A full circle is 360 degrees, and they can do shoulder internal rotation during a baseball pitch at 9,000 degrees per, like just ridiculous speed.
Incredible.
They produce incredible force, right? And so they've got incredibly strong internal rotation on their shoulder. But then, of course, it's moving at 9,000 degrees per second. They've got to slow that baby down and stop it.
Right.
So they've got to decelerate it with their external rotators. And what we find is because they're constantly working on this internal rotation, as part of their sport, that they're just about universally, they have stronger concentric internal rotation than they do eccentric external rotation. So there's generally an imbalance there in favour of the internal rotators are stronger. Mm-hmm. And that is a bigger difference there is associated with more shoulder injuries later in the season.
Ah.
Yeah.
Ah.
So it's quite a specific imbalance, right?
Wow, okay.
But it's a real thing.
Right.
And so if you were working with throwing athletes, you could measure their internal rotation concentric strength, right? And their external rotation eccentric strength, okay? And, using the same weight or flex band or whatever, dynamometer, and then just, what's the difference between the two? And then you would want to try and strengthen their eccentric external rotators, so basically strengthen the rotator cuff, right? But eccentrically, lengthening contraction. And that, should be effective in preventing injuries.
Okay, and could you give our listeners some examples of Pilates specific exercises or exercises that could be done in the Pilates setting that would do that?
So we're just talking about shoulder internal rotation, right? So basically if you bring your arm up to 90 degrees, so your elbow's at the height of your shoulder into abduction on that side, okay? And then if you bring rotate your arm so that your fist is pointing at the sky, that's external rotation. Mm-hmm. You rotate your arm so your fist is pointing forward, that's internal rotation, okay? And so what we want to do is work the external rotators, but in internal rotation. So we want to work them eccentrically, right? So what you would do is you would start in this, this position with your elbow by your shoulder and your fist pointing at the sky. So that's in external rotation. And you would kneel on the reformer, say on one spring, okay, facing the pulleys.
Right, okay, yeah.
And you hold a strap in that hand, okay? Now the strap is pulling you into internal rotation.
Yes.
Right? and you are decelerating that. So you're letting it pull you, but you're not letting it just fling you. You're controlling that you're decelerating it, right? And so that's working your eccentric external rotation strength, right?
Cool.
Yeah, and so things like draw the sword and stuff basically include that. There's an external and then there's an internal rotation component, right? But the thing is, we want to focus on the internal rotation component, and we're always stronger in the eccentric movement. So if you're doing the draw the sword movement, right? If you won't be you'll only be able to do it on a half spring or a one spring, right?
So for those that don't know what draw the sword is, because our cohort would know that more as side arms, kneeling, pulling. So you're kneeling on the carriage, one hand in the strap, and you're pulling that strap across the body, extending the arm up.
Yeah, it's part of the side arm series.
Side arm series. With the draw a sword, then you kind of bring it with control back across the body. With the more original OG repertoire of Joseph, it was more
elbow out, straight arm in.
I kind of call it air guitar. The imagery of air guitar, because you pull it across. It's a big circular movement, which I particularly love. So yeah. So just to give context to those who are hearing this draw a sword exercise, and you could do similar on the mat using power bands.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is that because of the way muscle architecture works, in any muscle, you can lower more than you can lift, right? So if I said to you, pick up that 100 kilo stone and put it on the table, right? That's much harder than picking up the 100 kilo stone off the table and putting it on the floor, right? And that's the same for any muscle in your body.
I feel like I would just nudge it off the table and let it drop. That's how I would problem solve that, right?
But even if you were to
with my toes
lower
out
it
of the
with
way.
control,
Yeah.
right? It's easier to lower it than it is to lift it, right? And that's the same for, it's easier to, on the down phase of a bicep curl, it's easier than on the up phase. And that's the same for any muscle in your body, right? It's always easier to lower it than to lift it, which means that to challenge it on the lowering phase, right, you've got to have more resistance than you do to challenge it on a raising phase, right? So if there's an exercise like draw the sword, right, where you're raising it, right, well, that's going to be heavy enough that you get a good workout on the raising phase, but it's going to be too light on the lowering phase.
And generally that kind of exercise is done on around about half a spring.
Right. So what I'm suggesting is to work this eccentric strength, what you would do is bump up the springs to maybe 1 or even 1.5, okay? You would use 2 hands on the concentric, okay, then let go and use that one arm to control the eccentric, the lowering phase, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's the way I'd approach it.
This is very cool.
Yeah. And so there are a couple of other relationships between measures of, muscle imbalance, and injuries and stuff. And there is a relationship between hip adduction and internal rotation when people land. On from a jump or whatever, is correlated, particularly in females. It's not the core per se, but it is correlated with higher incidence of knee injuries. So that is something that you could, work on.
So repeat it again. It's
so when you land from a jump, basically, if your knee goes in, basically.
Okay.
That's,
so valgus.
Yeah, valgus, knee valgus, internal rotation adduction. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. And what should we be working on with our client there?
You can practice jumping and landing without your knee going in. That's one thing.
Right.
And the other thing is you can strengthen the abductors of the hip, so it's like side splits on a heavy spring.
I was going to say side splits, heavy spring, no brainer.
Side leg series.
That's an easy one.
With an ankle weight, whatever.
Gotcha.
And also for hamstring injuries, which are the most common injury amongst runners, eccentric strengthening of the hamstrings is just like a magic pill. It basically reduces hamstring injuries by like 65%.
So I'm envisioning something like light spring, laying supine on the reformer, which is on your back, heels on the foot bar, lift your butt up, press the carriage out and in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or they push the carriage out, lift one leg off the bar, do pulses.
And back to my fitball class, which seriously,
you can do it on a fitball too.
Do it on a fitball. It's actually killer on a fitball because it's like doing it with no springs on a reformer, basically. If you want to feel your hamstrings cramp in 2 seconds, do it on a fitball. It's awesome.
But the thing is, like on that shoulder bridge exercise on the reformer, and also on a fitball, and also on a foam roller, typically when people get the cramp is on the when they're pulling the feet right into the butt.
Hell yeah!
But to really strengthen the hamstrings at long range, because typically hamstring tears occur when the hamstrings are at full extension.
Right.
So you want to strengthen probably at end range, not at inner range, for the hamstrings. So probably the bit where you straighten your leg is more important than the bit where you're pulling it right into your butt. And I would even go further and say probably something like a front split on a light spring, right, where you're working the front leg hamstrings at end range, like it's stretching and it's challenging the strength, right? That's probably the ideal exercise for hamstring injury prevention, in my view.
Cool. And that's a freaking tough exercise though. Like if we're talking about clients not falling off carriages and whatnot.
Well, you can hold their hand or give them
a
stick with a rubber foot on the end or whatever, because the balance aspect is not going to prevent hamstring injuries.
Yeah.
It's the loading the hamstring.
Yeah,
Yeah, you probably do the same thing on a lunge or whatever.
Cool.
Yeah. So can you help people prevent injuries, athletic injuries in Pilates? Yeah, I reckon you can. Work on the balance between their internal and external rotation strength. Work on the hip abduction and probably adduction strength as well to prevent groin injuries. We could throw that in.
Side split, side spring.
That's the one. And also hamstring strengthening, particularly at long range hamstring strengthening. But when we say strengthening, we don't mean activation. We mean like, fuck, that's hard strengthening. Like really, strengthen. Not just like lie there and think about your hamstrings.
Please activate. Please activate. Please activate. Please activate. Come on.
Let's put some load through those suckers.
I love it.
So maybe Pilates not so bad after all.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So all right. So Pilates for athletes. Can you improve athletic performance with Pilates? Probably not really, because it doesn't make sense that you can get better at moving heavy things really fast by moving light things really slowly. It just doesn't. And physiologically, principle of specificity, what we know about motor unit recruitment, Heinemann size principle is just, not a thing. Is Pilates really effective for strengthening the core? Yeah, but probably heavy back squats are better. And stir the pot. Don't forget stir the pot. Now, that's not to say Pilates can't do it. Pilates is freaking awesome as well. But it's like if your truly number one goal was just to get the most load through your abs and you didn't care how you did it, you just wanted to have the most effective way, you'd probably do back squats.
Or get yourself a fit ball.
Yeah. $20 from
Do you know what I mean?
Kmart.
Like most people can have a fit ball at home. Get yourself a fit ball.
And does core strengthening improve athletic performance marginally? Probably not worth the time you spend on it. You're probably better to spend that time doing more athletic things like practicing running or swimming or throwing or doing whatever it is that you do in your sport. And muscle imbalances, do they correlate with injury? Yeah, some of them do. But not the typical ones that you think about, maybe the upper cross, lower cross, the muscle slings, whatever. It's more like specific to a joint. So people have weak hamstrings relative to their quadriceps, they're more likely to get injured in the hamstring. People who have weak external rotators compared to their internal rotators in their shoulder are more likely to get a rotator cuff tear. People who have weak hip abductors and adductors are more likely to get a hip or knee injury. So strengthen up those suckers.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That was really cool.
Good talk.